Here we begin our study of U.S. history. We'll begin by looking at the creation of our nation. We'll begin right after the American colonies have already settled, become partially prosperous, and we'll begin at the moment where Britain begins to tighten its control on the colonists. A huge theme throughout the next couple of chapters is going to be this theme between power and liberty. Two words that we'll look more at as we go through. We'll begin with the road to revolution. How did we get to the American Revolution? And then we'll see exactly what went on in the American Revolution, the battles that were fought, the decisions that were made, the heroes of our revolution. And then we'll look how we went from a confederation to having a constitution. And then we'll examine the U.S. Constitution, why it matters now. Looking down here, we'll see that by studying the beginning of our nation, it can help us to better understand why our government and why our politics work the way they do today. America, at the beginning of its history, was an experiment, a trial to see if democratic and representative government could work. Patriot colonists imperiled their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor for the sake of principle. The values they fought for and the decisions they wrote into the Constitution echo throughout our history and shape our government and our lives today. Here we have a picture, a famous painting. In it, I want you to examine for a second and look at the faces of the soldiers fighting on the shores. There's a quote attached to it from Patrick Henry, who at the very beginning of the Revolution said, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." In this picture, you'll notice some faces that may perhaps look familiar. I recognize a few. Others I would have to research and see, compare to some portraits. But in it, I see Thomas Jefferson. I see George Washington. I think this looks like John Adams. I would have to double check. But you look through the faces, and it's the faces of our founding fathers. In it, in this picture, you see liberty and you see death. Where do you see death in this painting? You see the fallen soldiers? And also, where do you see liberty? I see a patriot proudly holding up the flag. The road to revolution. Here begins where our first readings will start. The tighter British control was, the more the colonists resisted. And then, once battle breaks out, we'll look at the road to Lexington and Concord and also declaring independence. For this video, we'll look at the first two, Section 1 and Section 2. Starting in 1763, Britain declared a proclamation and said that colonists could not settle in lands past the Appalachian Mountains, so it restricted westward expansion. There began some restraints, control from Parliament, who's in Britain, on the colonists. In 1765, we see Parliament passes a Stamp Act, and we'll look more at that, and how the colonists react to it. The colonists organized boycotts of British goods. 1767, Parliament passes another act, the Townshend Act. And once again, the colonists boycott, they continue, and then begin something that's very core to democratic values. Political activism spreads. And with any revolution, there is always battle. We have the Battle of Bunker Hill that we'll look at shortly. We'll look at the actual revolution battles. 1763, we mentioned Parliament begins passing acts. Another is the Tea Act. The colonists respond by destroying some ships and throwing tea into the Boston Harbor. In 74, the Intolerable Acts are passed. The colonists respond again by organizing, this time, the First Continental Congress. There will be a second in which we'll organize them for war. And then in 75, fighting begins at Lexington and Concord. And then in 1776, a very famous day in American history, one that we all should know. The Declaration of Independence announces American separation from Britain. A quick quiz right now. Which U.S. president, who then was a governor of Virginia and part of the Continental Congress, actually wrote the Declaration of Independence? If you know this answer, say it in your head right now. Your vocabulary for this one can be found on Quizlet.com/Mr. Denham. It will hit on all the big terms and names that we need to know for this section. From here, remember when you go into Quizlet, it's Mr. Denham. No period, just Mr. Denham. Here we begin in Section 1, Tighter British Control. Here we have a portrait of Benjamin Franklin's daughter. It begins on One American Story. In 1765, Sally Franklin's father, the famous American diplomat Benjamin Franklin, was in London to protest the Stamp Act. During his stay, Sally Franklin wrote her father long and detailed letters that were filled with news from the colonies. So she wrote her father. Often she wrote about family and friends, but Sally also had a keen interest in political affairs. In one letter, she vividly described the colonial reaction to the repeal of the Stamp Act. We have heard by a roundabout way that the Stamp Act is repealed. The bells rung, we had bonfires, and one house was illuminated. Indeed, I never heard so much noise in my life. The very children seemed distracted. Similar celebrations occurred throughout the colonies. Many thought the difficulties between Britain and America had finally come to an end. If you notice, this primary source came from around the time of 1765. And we know that revolution is just around the corner. So we know that time of peace, that feeling that they had, was only for a moment. The colonies and Britain grow apart. Pay attention to these key questions here. As I read and as we look at this, think about how you would answer this. If you were in class, how would you answer this right here? Why were the colonists threatened by Parliament's new laws? So our focus while we read this is this question right here. During the French and Indian War, American colonists helped the British defeat the French. The colonists took pride in the British victory, but soon found that the relationship with Britain had soured. In earlier days, the colonists had been allowed, for the most part, to manage their own affairs. In the 1760s, however, Parliament's new laws and restrictions threatened the colonists' freedom. Westward expansion restricted. After the French and Indian War, King George III, the British monarch, issued many reforms to tighten his control of the American colonies. First, he issued the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade the colonists from settling beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Although designed to maintain peace between the colonists and Native Americans, this law angered settlers who hoped to speculate or buy as an investment in Western lands. In addition, King George decided to keep 10,000 soldiers in the colonies to enforce the proclamation, but housing the troops proved very expensive. Therefore, Parliament passed the Quartering Act, a law that required colonists to house all British soldiers. Let me insert something right here. The French and Indian War, that's what we know about this conflict here in America. But in Europe and in India and other places, it was known as the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War. And it started in the colonies, and actually George Washington was part of the very beginning of the French and Indian War, but it spread throughout Europe, and it even spread to India, another British colony. So a lot of these conflicts that we'll see here that happened in America during this time period, there's an extension of it also in Europe. Later, whenever presidents begin to determine how the United States should interact in foreign affairs, for the most part, we're going to see for a long time that presidents and Congress keep coming back to this idea of isolationism to keep us out of conflicts in Europe and in other parts of the world. So this will be another thing that we'll talk about later on, of this isolationism. Parliament taxes the colonists. In addition to the cost of keeping troops in the colonies, Britain owed massive debts from the French and Indian War. To pay off these debts, Britain needed more revenue or income. As a result, Parliament looked to the colonies to pay part of the cost for frontier defense and colonial government. Looking at this right here, it does make sense that, Britain is in a lot of debt right now, and if Britain is going to supply soldiers to technically protect the colonists or to help enforce the Proclamation of 1763, Britain is thinking, why should we have to pay for that? Let the colonists pay for it. So Britain wants the colonists to pay for the soldiers. In Britain, this does make sense, but to the colonists who have enjoyed not paying a lot of taxes, and actually the colonists, compared to the people in Britain, only paid about 1/25 the tax that people in Britain did. So in the colonies, they paid about 4% of what others in Britain would have to pay. So if those in Britain, I realize I just misspelled Britain, were paying $100 in taxes, the colonists were only paying $4. So the taxes weren't extremely heavy when compared to the British, but the colonists were still feeling as though Britain was trying to place on them burdens that the colonists shouldn't have to bear. And we continue here in 1765. When you see this little beach ball right here, that means my computer's loading, so sometimes it may take a second. In 1765, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This law placed a tax on sugar, molasses, and other products shipped to the colonies. Making matters worse, in the following year, Parliament passed another one, the Stamp Act, a law that required all legal and commercial documents to carry an official stamp showing that a tax had been paid. In addition to wills and contracts, all newspapers and diplomas also had to carry a stamp. From Parliament's perspective, the Sugar and Stamp Act were reasonable ways to raise money in the colonies to pay off Britain's debts. From the colonists' perspective, however, these acts were seen as serious threats to their political rights. Their anger focused on two complaints. First, that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies. That was a job for the colonial assembly. And second, that no tax should be created without their consent. And this is going to lead into something that you probably at least have heard the phrase, no taxation without representation. At the end here, this is right here what you will see on your study guide. These parts at the very end of the sections are very important, and I love these. They ask different things, sometimes compare and contrast, sometimes summative, sometimes just different things. This one says, explain why the colonists disagreed with Parliament. So why did the colonists disagree with Parliament? What exactly did they disagree with? Well, they disagreed with the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. They also disagreed with the Quartering Act. And if we scroll back up, Is there anything else that they disagreed with? The proclamation of 1763, which limited their expansion. So if somebody in Virginia perhaps wanted to go west of the Appalachian Mountains to settle some land and be like those frontiersmen that we'll study later, according to the law, according to what Parliament had passed, they couldn't. They wouldn't be able to. So we go back and we look at our question and it asks, explain why the colonists disagreed with Parliament. So why did they disagree with these different acts right here? In this last part, it says why. First, that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies. That was the job for the Colonial Assembly, which is something that we'll look at as we get closer to Section 3. And then also the whole no taxation without representation. So your answer as to what they disagreed with and why is found right here at the very end. All right, we're going to now go to a commercial break, and then when we come back, we'll look at the colonists defy Parliament.
Tracy to kids, Tracy to kids, come in kids, come in kids. It's here at last, the new Dick Tracy two-way wrist radio that keeps you in constant touch with your buddies. Easy to work, up antenna, switch on, press talk button, and you broadcast from room to room and even house to house. No wires needed, yet voices travel back and forth. Radio on the open road from one bike to another, or when out hiking.
Dad, I found a bear's cave.
Be right down, son.
The powerful, fully transistorized Dick Tracy two-way wrist radio is a real electronic instrument.
Make sure all the fellows get their A-OK Dick Tracy wrist radio so they can keep in touch. Over and out.
The one and only Dick Tracy wrist radio, wherever American toys are sold.
Okay, welcome back from the commercial break. We're going to continue with colonists defy Parliament. Key question, how did the colonists react when Parliament took over the Assembly's power to tax? So here in a second, we'll look at the Colonial Assembly. We continue to look, and it begins with the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act enraged the colonists. Everywhere, people took up the cry, "No taxation without representation," to protest the attack on their rights. Patrick Henry, a member of Virginia's House of Burgesses, demanded resistance. When another member shouted that resistance was treason, Henry said to have replied, "If this be treason, make the most of it." The colonists organized. In 1765, delegates from 9 colonies formed the Stamp Act Congress in New York. During this meeting, delegates drafted a petition to the king protesting the Stamp Act and declared that the right to tax the colonists belonged to the colonial assemblies, not to Parliament. This was the first time the colonies had united in opposition to British policy. Meanwhile, some colonists formed secret societies, such as Sons of Liberty, to oppose British policies. Occasionally, they enraged people to attack custom officials and burn the stamps. As a result, many custom officials quit their jobs and returned to England. So imagine you were an Englishman. You weren't a colonist. You came to the colonies from Britain to be a businessman, to earn money and to work for the government. And now the colonists, where you work, are saying we don't agree with Parliament and that we don't like paying the Stamp Acts. And where you work, they come in and they start burning your office and they destroy all of the stamp making equipment. So either you stay and possibly be injured, or maybe you join their side because you realize, well, maybe this stuff shouldn't happen. Or you do as what most of them did. Many custom officials quit their jobs. The colonists and complaints against Parliament were bitter, loud, and sometimes violent. But the most effective protest took the form of a boycott, which is a widespread refusal to buy British goods. So when it comes to British goods, if you were going to buy, let's say, a British picture frame, with the boycott now, anything that was made in Britain, no one would buy. And I do realize my little picture frame almost looks like a TV, which had not yet been invented. By refusing to buy goods from England, the colonists targeted British merchants. The colonists hoped that these merchants, faced with declining sales, would influence Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Sometimes, some British politicians sided with the colonists. Parliamentary leader William Pitt spoke out against the Stamp Act. William Pitt, quoted from a collected papers called Patriots, said, "The Americans have not acted in all things with prejudice and good temper. They have been driven to madness by injustice. Will you punish them for the madness you have caused? My opinion is that the Stamp Act be repealed absolutely, totally, and immediately." So William Pitt is one that says the only reason that the colonists are angry is because of the way that the Parliament has been taxing them. So Pitt says Britain, comma, it's your fault. So Britain could only blame itself. The colonists' tactic worked, and Parliament finally repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But at the same time, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament had supreme authority to govern the colonies. Although the colonists celebrated the repeal of the Stamp Act, the great argument between Parliament and the colonies had begun. So now we're going to see an ultimate battle between Parliament versus the colonies. Now the battle's been kind of quiet. Now it is loud and in everybody's face. Parliament versus the colonies. So we look at our cause and effects. This is one of your test statements or questions down here. It's asking you, explain how the colonists reacted when Parliament took over the Assembly's power to tax.
Einstein, James Dean, Brooklyn's got a winning team. Davy Crockett, Peter Pan,